Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Securing ICS Using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and Fortinet, Best Practices for the Real World, sponsored by Fortinet. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Barbara Filkins, Research Director of the SANS Analyst Program, Don C. Weber, SANS Instructor, and Peter Newton, Senior Director, Products and Solutions at Fortinet. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Barbara.
Thank you, Carol. And I'd like to take a second and just review our agenda today. We're basically going to spend the first 35 minutes of this webcast with kind of an interactive panel and presentation with the three participants, myself, Don, and Peter. Then we're going to do a quick Fortinet presentation by Peter, and then we're going to have audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, hang in there. So very quickly, to go over one of the cornerstones of this webcast is really asking the question of why are we here? And we have three objectives. The first is implementation guide for the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as it applies to industrial control systems. The second is to talk about the effective implementation of that CSF with the Fortinet fabric. And finally, to present a quick overview of Fortinet and a summary of the products. So more specifically, why are we here in terms of the NIST CSF and ICS? Well, we all know that in terms of IT and OT, industrial control systems, moving to the cloud and the adoption of IoT, we're continually facing that challenge of the dissolving perimeter, which has been in the news for the last several years. And it's really key that organizations establish security programs that span both the IT and the OT operational domains. One of the solutions, especially for those that aren't necessarily regulated, such as the small water company that I'll talk to you briefly, the use of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or the CFS, can provide a framework for a converged security program. And one of the tenets of the CSF is that it provides a common language that's intended to improve communications as well as understanding and collaboration between IT and OT. The challenge is how to go about implementing it. Just backing up a little bit, the three elements that we always touch on in probably almost any security project is the people, process, and technology triad. From the people side, how to align inherent differences in culture, purpose, and principles between the IT side and the OT workforces. The OT workforce very often has situational assessment of what their production system looks like, and the IT side can be a more abstracted view of that in terms of risk and governance. Then there's the question of how to design and modify processes to reduce the loss of process integrity or quality from an increasing risk of cyber threats or attacks while still maintaining production principles and throughput. And finally, the technology, how to reduce the exposure that's fueled by this dissolving perimeter, this improved connectivity, especially in legacy environments where the old habits, such as reluctance to patch, die hard, and often with good purpose. Don or Peter, do you have any high-level thoughts that you'd like to chime in on these three traditional elements?
Well, this is Don Weber. I basically want to bring up, I really like your first point there. Probably one of the most important things that I have people approach me about whenever I'm at the SANS courses, teaching and doing some of the SANS at night, is when I'm approached by OT teams, their biggest recommendation is that the IT and the IT security teams come in, talk to the OT teams, learn about the processes and learn what they're trying to accomplish before they start, making suggestions for modification and changes to the environment. So they're really looking for that communication and the IT teams to come to them and just learn about them in the process.
And this is Peter, and I would reinforce that. You know, I come from a company that focuses a lot on selling the technology, but the understanding between the two IT and OT organizations is really critical to the success of any technology deployment. And yeah, we have companies that are in various stages of their cybersecurity journey as they look to shift from old habits. But the cornerstone of that is, and to make sure that that change in those deployments are sustained, is that really understanding and communication between those two groups.
Yeah, I would agree with you guys wholeheartedly. I'm very deeply now instructing on the safety aspects in an industry that is considered transportation side of ICS, which is aviation. But that blending of the two pieces, IT and OT, and the formulation of culture, I think is really important as well. Moving on, this idea of security by design. So as we move into talking about how you might implement the CSF to help achieve these elements of this converged objective, we'll talk a little bit about a practical build out, how to go through it, then a practical build out using a fabric-based approach, and then the specific details around the Fortinet project. So just as a matter of review, the cybersecurity framework has three chief tenets. The first is the core. Those are the elements that are the desired activities and outcomes that are common across all critical infrastructure sectors. And we talk about defined functions, categories, and subcategories, and requirements that can be developed to evaluate both the current or an as-is profile and a future state, the 2B or 2B profiles. A profile is actually a unique organizational description of what the environment looks like, both currently and future. And so if you have the current profile, you know where you want to go in terms of where you want to be in the future, you can kind of build that roadmap of requirements to go from what you are to what you want to be. And then the final thing is the implementation tiers that kind of give insight into how an organization can view its risk and management. And even though it's not a maturity model per se, it can help guide. One of the starting points almost for any practical security-based infrastructure project is the availability of a reference architecture. And in terms of what SANS provides, and I'll let Don talk briefly about this, the curriculum has kind of developed a reference model that's built on several of the industry standards. So Don, do you want to just elaborate a little bit on the use of a reference architecture, what it is and what it is not?
Oh, absolutely. And thanks. This is this image actually comes directly from the ICS 410 class that we teach at various events. It's how we leverage this image is we've taken the Purdue model and we're using this image right here to introduce the concepts of the Purdue model and the different levels of field devices and management servers and other things that go into the process to help the IT and IT people coming into this field understand how processes are employed by the sector that they're moving into. But what this has been updated to do, and it's directly taking out of the IEC 62443, is it's also representing the boundaries, the security boundaries at the different levels to help organize the conversation around it so the IT teams as well know how we're going to start approaching security within this model.
So in effect, a reference map or a reference architecture helps provide part of a basic roadmap, kind of lays out what you need to be looking at. The other part of that equation is the project management steps, so to speak, if you will, on going from a starting point to an ending point. So your starting point is you're going to be starting with your as-is profile, but you also want to start with a fairly well-defined concept of where you want to end up. And the ending point is going to be that to-be profile. You know what the system changes you need, and you have a supporting system security plan that addresses the people and process part of that so that it is harmonized with what you need to do in the operational world. The 5 steps basically are: first, prioritize functions and subcategories as related to the CSF. Then do some discovery of what the as-is profile is. You may know what your environment is, but there are some details that may be missing or you need to focus on. Then you're going to look at gaps. Assess the difference between what that as-is, where you are now, and the to-be, where you want to go. And then from there, you can develop your roadmap and come up with an execution plan. So very quickly, just taking a look at a profile, and I actually applied this because I'm involved with a water company. This is in the paper, and it's kind of an example of a cloud-based control system for a fairly simple water company. 2 wells, a couple tanks. We have well sensors and control devices that say what the water depth is in the well, provide electronic meter reading for the end users or the endpoints, allow VFD controls that control the pump speed and also chlorine injection. And then tank sensors. There's a feedback system so that as the water level goes down in the well, and we tell that from the pressure sensors, it tells the wells to spool up. Right now, it's all been done in a manual basis, and the thought would be is to actually put in place some level of local control, field installable units that can be remotely monitored, that can provide some of this balancing between when we need to pump and when we don't need to pump. There's no local supervisory level. It all feeds up to an AWS controlled network or AWS-based control network. The links are cellular, and the water superintendent can sit in his office and look at the HMI and historian on a web-based application. So this is kind of the simple example that was brought out in the paper. So the first step is to prioritize, and this is where it gets kind of interesting because the objectives for an OT, an operational system, are not necessarily the same as might be in an IT employment. There's the need to maintain human safety, environmental safety, process quality, meet production throughput and demands, and potentially protect intellectual assets of an enterprise, especially in the manufacturing space. So what we do is we will go, what you want to do in this step is take a look, let's say, at those 5 objectives plus your enterprise need, and look at them against the functions and categories in the CSF and say, we need to assign this a high, medium, or low category. And representative values might be high. In other words, they have to be implemented quickly, less than 6 months, medium, 6 to 12 months, and low, less than 24 months. But those boundaries, those timeline boundaries, will definitely vary within the organization. The next step is to establish scope. It's really to discover your as-is profile. And this is where those people, process, and technology pieces come together. People are your organizational structure, your roles, responsibilities, the expectations, and the overall organizational culture and commitment. Really what you're looking here is to also define the critical roles that fill in the gaps around your operational automation. The process, the policies and procedures, this process flow, playbooks and automation, where we tend to traditionally think of when somebody says process. But you also need to look at them in light of the safety and the security for production. How are you going to measure it? Are there any metrics? And what is the change management process that needs to be put in place so that you're disciplined as you go through configuration and integration? And finally, the technology. And this is where it's an emphasis on infrastructure, and it encompasses both physical locations and virtual assets. You have tools, interface specifics, and design, configuration, integration demands that will kind of flow from that discipline change management process. So in this step, you really want to have a plan on how to go about, and this is partially helping develop your as-is environment. There's more, or profile, there's more information in the paper. Obviously, you're going to review documentation. You really need to make sure you understand the processes to understand the flow. And that is from the standpoint, because you're going to be looking at those flows in your gap assessment to see where there might be shortcomings, either in safety or security. You want to talk to the individuals who work directly with the networks and systems. This, again, is that discussion we just had about bring your OT security team or your OT engineers in the early stages when you start looking at how you're going to build the system and put security in by design. Review the device configurations, know where the wires go, and pay close attention to wireless, because some of those wires might be wireless, and what information is crossing them. And request any configuration information about any cloud assets. Peter, do you want to add anything to this list?
Well, actually, I'd like to make a comment about the planning process and having the plan. And it sounds like it could be daunting to some folks to say, hey, there's a huge amount of work here, and how can we do this all in one pass? And one of the things I'd like to provide some, I guess, insight or perspective on is, you don't have to do all the implementation at one pass, and you can develop your plan. Doesn't have to be we've got to put in all the security and fix everything in a month or in 6 months. This might be a multi-year process, but it's important to have a plan so you can know where you are and know where you're going, and then revisit that plan. So I guess my encouragement is don't be overwhelmed. Recognize you can approach this in bite-sized chunks, but as long as you're making progress towards that goal, that's the real important thing.
Good point. So let's go on to step 3. And this is kind of on the heart of beginning to get to that process that planned roadmap that Peter kind of mentioned. So you've kind of prioritized your objectives. You've pulled together a whole bunch of information to evaluate your situation. Now the question is to identify and assess any gaps. So use a checklist. Simple problems. Is it possible to run anything independently in manual mode? You may need that. Do you have backup or downtime procedures to maintain production if your automation goes south? How flat is your security? How many of your systems share infrastructure? Those are representative questions. There's more information in the white paper. Then what you want to do is you want to establish those gaps broadly at a category level, narrowly at a subcategory level, or a mix of both. Is your incident response process really robust enough? And if it isn't, where are the gaps? And then as you build those gaps and define them in terms of actions. Make them actionable requirements that can be specified in terms of people, process, or technology, so they naturally become the implementation requirements for the next step. The language of the NIST CSF is fairly high level and it's fairly abstract. At this stage, you can take that high level language down and make it actionable. I need to develop an incident response team. My asset management functionality needs to be such and such. From the gaps and those requirements, those gaps and those implementation requirements that you had in step 3, now what you can do is you can start to look at your operational roadmap. Remember when I talked about those priorities? You have your 6-month window, which is immediate, it's operational. You have a more tactical, short to mid-range, 6 to 12 months. And then the strategic, 12 to 24 months is the long range. Most organizations kind of look at the operational and tactical cycles, and I more often than not find where the security planning isn't really baked into their strategic plan. And that long-range plan, you don't want to get too far out because 5 years, the technology moves too fast. But if you know where you're going with an aim point at the 12 to 24 month event horizon, it really can help. It can help maintain the stability and growth of the cybersecurity activities, and it also provides the basis for saying how your planning is aligned with your enterprise's strategic plans and mission statement. That's not to say you want to go strategic. You still need to focus on the short-term activities that shape that longer strategy, the plan, policy, procedure development, review, and update. But the balance of those two will get kind of what Don was saying, is you can actually do your planning in bite-sized chunks. And then, of course, you have the immediate needs of the operational. So kind of a way to look at this in starting the journey is you can take your categories, and these are the shorthand from the NIST CSF. You know what's high, medium, and low priority. You can look at the subcategories, which in this case are access control. And you can say, gee, my gaps are large or medium or small, and I really don't have, you can kind of, you've got everything's high priority, but now you can start to prioritize within that high priority area of, let's say, access control. So you can pinpoint what you want to put your efforts and resources and budget on short term. And so here we see a case where 3 of the largest gaps are operational. They're fairly expensive in terms of budget, but because they fall into that operational area, they should probably become the first 6 to 12 months of effort, as opposed to efforts that might be medium in tactical sense or strategic, that are small at this point and may increase in, the gap can increase as you move more, let's say, into an automated world. So this is the kind of tool where you can lay out your priorities both in terms of a time frame and in terms of a budget. And if presented properly, this is a great tool to show management. One last comment I wanted to make is, the question is about cybersecurity maturity. We talked a little bit about the tiers. Tier 1 is partial, Tier 2 is risk-informed, Tier 3 is now you have things that are repeatable, and now you have an adaptive in Tier 4. It really isn't a security model per se. It's more of a way of looking at your risk management process. Now, up to now, we've done gaps. We've closed gaps. Once the gaps are closed, now you have the basis to really start assessing what your risks might be in that 2B profile. And so now what you can do is you can move forward across the tiers and say, gee, I'm going to work from my starting point to eventually be coming up with a repeatable process that will reduce risk, and eventually I can adapt it to new things. So effectively, this can provide a maturity framework. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Don, but before I go, I just want to say one of the things that can help center your operational and tactical decisions is there are areas that across various engagements and across various focuses that SAN has had, that there are areas that have emerged as critical areas for improvement. Network segmentation, isolation, access control, logging, monitoring, auditing, asset management, and incident response. And with that, I'd like to hand it to Don for a discussion on.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. Can everybody hear me now?
Sounds good, Don.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And once again, thanks, Barb, for laying that out, talking about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and how that can be used to help direct a security program within an ICS environment. It's definitely something that I've had recent experience with and moving things forward. When SANS approached me, when the advisory program approached me to take a look at this and work with Barb and work with Fortinet to kind of look at ICS and how the NIST cybersecurity framework can help improve security around it, I was very excited, because this is what I've been recommending to my clients. This is how I've the approach that I've been recommending to the students that come to the SANS classes that I'm helping to provide with the SANS team. And so what it also gave me an opportunity to do was to take the cybersecurity framework. I know that this is what we're recommending from a security program standpoint, but also to relate the idea that and address a lot of the questions that I'm getting from the teams and from the management when I do assessment, which is what can fine. We need to take a look at the policies and programs, how we're approaching it, but what can the team do right now while we're developing those new policies around it? And so that's what Barb kind of laid it out here, which are the kind of the 5 recommendations that I've been providing to that management team, providing to the OT and the IT teams that are trying to improve the security of their environments, and looking at the Fortinet security fabric, kind of help round that out, and considering what can be done and how teams can leverage new technologies to try to improve that. So I'm going to cover these 5 things really quickly. Obviously, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of try to elicit the help of Fortinet to answer some questions, because I know that from a tactical standpoint, the OT teams are looking for that. What are the answers to some of the questions? So I'm going to cover some of the key topics that I cover in the paper, the white paper that we're putting up on the website, but also to kind of prime the pump with questions for Fortinet, so that the OT teams and the managers within these environments can understand what Fortinet's bringing to the table and around these projects. So the next slide real quick. So the first thing that I like to have suggest that teams take a look at and try to adjust is network segmentation. While everybody can agree that the network segmentation and isolation is important for these environments, the reason why we do security assessments, the reason why we're training people around these things, is that we're still seeing these issues, especially outside of critical infrastructure in organizations, maybe in food and beverage, or that don't have regulations around it. And so there are still some network issues. These are 4 bullet points that I usually try to have people address, start at least looking into what their teams can start gathering information for, so that they can understand their maturity around that. Some of these are pretty obvious, which is basically isolating the control networks from the corporate networks, starting to protect some of those management servers from communications to each other and down into the processes, and then limiting some of the access that vendors have, so that they know when those outside connections are coming in. As you can see from the slide, what I've tried to identify, and certainly different experiences may come up with different solutions, but I looked at these 3 technologies in the white paper, kind of to determine what their functionality was, and to kind of bring that out as far as what OT teams might consider when they're moving forward with that. So these are just some of the things that when you're considering network segmentation, that your team might want to ask questions about of the Fortinet team as we're moving forward. So one of the first questions, if you can change to the next slide, please, that I came up with, and I'm hoping that Peter can help us with this. I was hoping, go back a slide. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm hoping that you can help us understand where one of your clients within an ICS environment have leveraged the FortiGate product and the Fortinet product, how they've implement this successfully within a control environment.
Sure, and Don, thanks for the question. So our FortiGate, which is our next generation firewall, has the ability with our OT services on it to identify the specific types of protocols that are used in OT environments. So an example of how a customer was able to deploy that, there was a manufacturer in the upper Midwest who decided to whitelist those protocols that they knew that existed on their network, thereby blocking all other protocols and simplifying, cleaning up the communication in their network, and just making sure that there's nothing in there that isn't something that they understand. Because the 48 can look at those communications and those protocols, it can differentiate between and identify the approved OT specific protocols. So that's an example that I know of where someone's leveraging our next generation firewall to improve communication control.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate that. So after network segmentation, obviously we want to take a look at that. But if we've implemented some segmentation, if we've done some isolation, if we're still allowing access to go between our corporate environment and our control network, we're still going to have pathways through to there. So while we may have improved our situation with those isolation and segmentation, we still want to take a look at our access control. So a few things in here. Some of this may require some testing, obviously, hopefully not some full site acceptance testing, but certainly in some cases it might. But we definitely want to start limiting or at least understanding the distribution of default credentials and changing those where they make sense. Additionally, moving our vendors, our integrators, and even some of our team, our internal teams, the engineers and operators that are coming in from our corporate network, forcing them through jump boxes rather than allowing them to leverage group credentials internally, which degrades our ability to attribute actions to specific individuals, force them through jump boxes so that we know who's leveraging those credentials at what specific time. And then like the bullet says, updating our Active Directory within there that is controlling our master servers within our control networks, definitely separating that from our corporate network. We don't want to have any type of trust between the two, and implementing that correctly. So if we go over to the next slide, please. Then this has our next question for Fortinet, which is how can the one of the things that my understanding is that the Forti Authenticator can integrate with Windows Active Directory environment. So how would that leverage that to improve their Active Directory? Go ahead.
Yes, Don, I apologize for stepping on you there. You cut out slightly. So yeah, our Forti Authentication product is able to leverage Active Directory and then become an enforcement for that role-based access. So when you come up with a policy, Forti Authenticator, and in conjunction with Forti Token to provide that multi-factor authentication, means that the people that are on your network are truly the people that you think are on your network. So one of the big cybersecurity challenges in IT and OT networks is that weak credentials or even default credentials enable bad actors to gain access. So absolutely agree with the recommendation to change those default passwords, but you want to make sure that you know who's on your network and then give them the appropriate access. And that's where an authentication service like Forti Authenticator with two-factor integrated with Active Directory and group policy enables enforcement of those policies on the network.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that, and helping people understand how these technologies can help, if they can help as they're considering the updates. I think that's really important. What I'm trying to show here, and hopefully people have some questions about that for you at the end about the Forti Authenticator and how to implement it. So after access control, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So we did network segmentation. We talked about access control, but we need to have an understanding of what's going on within our OT environment. Typically, our systems aren't configured to beyond the default states associated with logging. If a lot of systems will be logging locally, a lot of applications will be logging locally, but we have not, most organizations have not modified their configuration settings for their servers, have not modified their configuration settings for the applications to improve the logging locally. And that's my first recommendation. Take a look at what you can do on these master servers. We'll work with your integrators to increase the logging locally before you even think about sending those off into a central logging location, because that's going to be the first step. It's going to take a while to think about how to forward logs across your different environments and where you want it to send it. Do you want to send it internal to a SOC within your OT environment? Do you want to send it external? There's going to be a lot of questions around there. So we need to take that step to improve the information we're collecting locally, as long as it's not having a negative impact on those servers. When we're planning on getting logging information from our resources within our OT environments, my recommendation is start with the boundaries. Look at our firewalls, look at what our network devices are logging, and try to improve that, or at least collect that in a central location, then move to our servers, and then if we can, move on down to our controllers and so forth. After that, obviously, we're collecting information. We need to start looking at it. We need to start baselining. We need to consider tuning, because information coming in, once we start looking at stuff, alarms are going to go off. We have to tune that appropriately. We need to plan for that. So those are what I talk about to my clients and my students when we consider logging. So can we go to the next slide, please? So Pete, can you help? One of the problems that I see, or at least I foresee with an organization that's thinking about bringing in a logging solution, whether it's the FortiSIEM or whether it's the FortiAnalyzer, is potentially that's going to be a new product within their environment, and they're going to start seeing things and they're going to need help tuning. So, how does your team or the teams that deploy your systems, what does Fortinet bring to the table to help OT teams with that type of issue?
Well, we do offer professional services for all of our products, so it is possible for us to come on site and have Fortinet badge employees assist with the stand-up and tuning and baselining for these products to make sure they work in the OT environment. I will say that most of our deployments, we're actually working with a channel partner who is well versed with these products. And so most of our deployments actually have that partner guiding the customer on their initial deployment and training. In addition, we also offer straight up product training where you can actually take classes in all of these things. So if you have staff that you want to get more intelligent on the FortiSIEM, on FortiAnalyzer, on FortiInsight, we actually have classes that they can sign up for, go and attend, and even get certifications for. So professional services, channel partner support, as well as training are three ways that we help new clients, new customers to these products come up to speed with them.
Awesome. Yeah. So there are integrators, and that's what I experience. Most of the organizations that I communicate with, they're used to dealing with integrators. So having another integrator associated with these would probably be a good thing. It's I know it doesn't necessarily have that require staff augmentation. They have the force multiplier of bringing in people that can help them deploy and hopefully turn to as they are tuning and so forth. So I think that's a good thing. Thanks for pointing that out. Next slide, please. So the next one, the fourth one that's on my list is asset management. I've actually, as part of SANS, I review these things with a part of the SANS team. One of the recommendations that I've heard from a lot of people is, hey, we need to put and recommend asset management as the first thing. And while I agree, to a certain extent, But I also think that asset management is a difficult challenge for a lot of people. Identifying the assets out there, confirming that our manual techniques typically that we use to maintain our environments and understand what's out there. We need to automate it. We need to gather information, implement technologies that help the teams automate that. But I still think that's a bigger challenge. I think we can, from a tactical standpoint, that we do need to probably consider this after we've looked at some of those other things, the access control, the network segmentation and access control. But it's still very valuable. It's still extremely important that we start thinking about it, we start addressing it, even if it's going through and doing it by hand. Certainly, the best way to do these, the most accurate way to do these, is to automate it. Look at our look at what our hardware is out there. Look what software is out there. Start understanding where it is, and start getting some automated way to collect this information so our teams can concentrate on more specific things. So when I was looking at the Fortinet, when I was looking at the FortiSIM, I did see some data collection around assets, and I thought that was extremely important. So if we go to the next slide. So one of the things that I didn't see, and I didn't, and I know that most products integrate with other products, but what I was hoping, Peter, that you could help me understand, and help everybody on the call understand, is how do the Fortinet products, Fortinet, FortiSIM, what type of asset management software solutions do they integrate with, and that can be used by the team? And have you deployed that in an ICS environment, not just an IT environment?
Sure. So Fortinet itself has some powerful asset discovery capabilities and is deployed into OT environments for that purpose. But we have a lot of OT customers that might have different asset management solutions out there. Companies like Nozomi or Clarity, Dragos, Packet Fence. There's a variety of other companies out there that have partnered with Fortinet, and their asset management and discovery systems can feed into the security fabric and provide that inventory visibility. So a lot of these inventory visibility OT specific companies need the security fabric to then be an enforcement for the things that they see and the inventory that they discover on the network.
Excellent, thanks, Peter. I do need on to my next slide, though. The last thing, the final tactical thing that I bring up with your information. You're going to be identifying things within your environment. Your OT personnel are going to be educated around some of the new information security, and actually, somebody's going to eventually attack an organization. So our OT teams, our IT teams, they need to have an understanding of how they're going to approach these things, how they're going to identify things, how they're going to identify events, and keep everybody from jumping to the conclusion that it's a security event. So organizations need to start talking about this. They need to start addressing this up front. And it's one of the things, doing tabletop sessions with everybody, sitting down and just talking through what could happen, what bad could happen. OT people talking to the IT people about, okay, what actually is bad to occur within the OT environment, and then IT security can talk to the OT people about, okay, digitally, here's how that might happen, and so everybody can come to an understanding around that. I do have a question on the next slide, but we're running out of time. I want to make sure that that everybody has questions has time to answer questions at the end. I know that the answer is going to be very similar to the one that's about logging anyways. So Barb, I think we can just kind of skip through this next one and move on to Peter's part of the presentation.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Barb. So this last part of the presentation is simply to make sure that folks are aware of who Fortinet is. Yes, we did help with this webinar, but a lot of people we still find aren't aware of everything that we do. So I'll go through these quickly enough so that we can have some time for Q&A. But Fortinet is actually the #1 cybersecurity company in the world. We ship more firewalls than anyone else and have done so for many years. We now constitute more than 30% of all global firewalls shipped. Part of the reason for that is our technology innovation, as indicated by our more than 650 patents, which is 3 times our nearest competitor. We're 18 billion in market cap with more than 2 billion revenue, and we have almost 500,000 customers around the world, protecting 70% of the Fortune 100. Next slide, please. We are a global company. We are based in North America. Our headquarters is in Sunnyvale, and our largest engineering centers are in Canada and in the US, although we do have others around as a result of acquisitions. We also have support centers that span the globe, so no matter where your operations are, we do have follow the sun capabilities. And we, as noted, we do have now more than 7,000 employees worldwide. Next slide, please. Fortinet is best known for our firewall technologies. In fact, this is Gartner's Magic Quadrant for firewalls. You can see we are a clear leader in this space, and we have been in this quadrant for many, many years. So it is just an indication of a third-party validation of our strengths. Next slide, please. In addition to Gartner, we also seek other third-party recommendations and validations of our security effectiveness. NSS Labs is a third-party organization that creates their own tests and then conducts them on equipment and then publishes the reports. And we're very proud to say that for all the cybersecurity companies, we have more recommendations from NSS Labs than anyone else. And by the way, those recommendations are based both on effectiveness of the solution and the return on investment, or the cost effectiveness of the solution. So as you can see, we participate broadly and are highly recommended. Next slide, please. One thing that I'm personally proud of Fortinet for doing is that Fortinet is taking significant steps to address the cybersecurity skills shortage. To that end, we have a whole program of training and certification that can take someone from not knowing anything about cybersecurity to being a highly trained specialist. So we have these courses that are available for public consumption. You can take the courses. We do have training classes for that. We also partner with more than 200 universities worldwide, where they've taken our coursework and created programs around it. So we're doing our part to increase the level of cybersecurity awareness and increase the number of cybersecurity trained individuals in the world. Next slide, please. Specific to OT, we do surveys on a regular basis out to OT folks, and we ask them a variety of questions. This is from our most recent published survey, and we were very happy to see that when we asked OT organizations, who do you think of when you think of companies with OT security, we were very happy to see that Fortinet was recognized as a leader by many folks. Next slide, please. Fortinet's solution for security in both IT and OT is based on our philosophy of a security fabric. And our security fabric delivers on three key criteria. One, it provides broad visibility across the entire attack surface. As more and more things have become digitized, there's more and more avenues of attack, but we have all kinds of different products that can detect those things no matter what that threat vector is. Secondly, it's an integrated solution, meaning these are not simply point products that operate in silos, but rather they share information. So if one part of the fabric sees something, it can share it with another part of the fabric. Finally, this platform is automated in the sense that if it sees something happen on the network in one part of the fabric, another part of the fabric can take automated action against it to contain threats in real time. Now, one very important thing about this platform is you'll notice that at the 1 o'clock area, it says Open Fabric Ecosystem. This security fabric is not a Fortinet only solution. There are more than 250 vendors who are integrated into the fabric and can engage with and extend the broad visibility, the integration, and automation elements of this platform. It is, the cornerstone of the fabric is our firewalls, but it is far broader than Fortinet's product portfolio. Next slide, please. An example of some of the products that support those solution areas you saw on the security fabric. You've seen some of these already in Don's slides, where we talk about the FortiGates, the switches, the access points, the network access, the FortiAnalyzer, the FortiSIM. All of these solutions are relevant to organizations that are deploying OT security as well as IT security. Next slide, please. And finally, we do support the NIST model and the ability to see all the elements of the various elements, and the various parts of the fabric will work together to meet each of these requirements. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Barb for the Q&A section. Thank you.
And actually, I'm going to turn it back to Carol for handling the Q&As. So, Carol?
All right, thanks everyone for that great presentation. We do have quite a few questions ready for the Q&A, so I will jump right in and get started. This first one came in at the very beginning while Barbara was speaking. It says, are firewalls used to segment ICS components at all the different layers of the Purdue model? For example, a firewall separating ICS components from group 0 to group 1, etc.
This is Peter. I'd be happy to take that question. We typically don't see it at every level of the Purdue model. Obviously, the first step is between 3.5 and 4. You want to get that firewall in there to provide segmentation between the IT and OT organization, as Don mentioned. But we also see it and recommend it at between the 2 and 3. Now, you might want additional firewalls that might to segment different lines of production. So if you have a similar production line, you might have a firewall between similar lines. And of course, if you have a distributed organization where you have remote areas, you would probably want firewalls at the edges of those locations as well. But you don't need a firewall at every single level of the Purdue model.
Right, and this is Don. You know, typically what I'm finding recommending, especially from an initial standpoint, is between 2 and 3. Most organizations are going to have some type of networking architecture that can do access control rules and the processes and their master servers, and between process and process. Typically, that's what our recommendation is, to get over that tactical hump, the initial steps. And then as they start understanding the risk more in those areas, determining if they need additional protections.
All right, thank you. What extra functionality does FortiAuthenticator provide? I'm assuming that FortiToken provides 2FA.
Yes, this is Peter. Yes, the FortiToken is the two-factor authentication. FortiAuthenticator is then creating that a single sign-on, a single point of authentication across your network, because you're going to have multiple firewalls deployed, and so they need to go to a single place to get that authentication verification. So the FortiAuthenticator will integrate with your Active Directory databases, and then be able to coordinate all the firewalls throughout your organization to have that, and also even web services, so that you have a single sign-on experience. So there's a kind of a coordination point for the authentication within the network, and then there's the actual authentication of the person with the two-factor that FortiToken takes care of. So that's the differences between those two solutions. But they're, as you can see, they're very complementary.
Peter, this is Don. One of the questions that I had is whether or not the FortiToken is an on-prem solution, or does it require a cloud-based connection?
It does not require a cloud-based connection, so that it can be completely an on-prem solution.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. What is the difference between FortiSIEM and FortiAnalyzer?
Ooh, that's a good question. This is Peter again. So FortiSIEM is more of a threat hunting after type of tool, frequently used by the security team. FortiAnalyzer is much more about reportings. So you would use FortiAnalyzer for your audit reports to show various compliance with the appropriate regulatory requirements. FortiSIEM is more about when you see something specific, it's going to be pulling in information from all kinds of different areas to help triangulate and understand exactly what happened on the network. So they are very complementary, very similar, but they do have a different focus and different use case.
All right, thank you. So this one's for you, Peter. Just to clarify, if we have segmentation and isolation in place, FortiAuthenticator is still able to authenticate against an Active Directory domain. Can you expand on the architecture that supports this? Is there a DMZ?
I have to think. This is Peter. I have to think through that. We certainly do support authentication in a segmented network. Segmentation is one of the first base recommendations we have for networks, and the authentication can work across those segments. It can be used to enforce the role-based policies for that for those individuals that are getting authenticated. A DMZ is not required, but if you want to use a DMZ, you can certainly use a DMZ as well.
All right, thanks. This next one is for Don. Regarding asset management, aren't many organizations in ICS scope subject to some regulation that requires computer systems validation, which requires that all systems components are identified and controlled?
Okay, thank you. I would say that when you're looking at critical infrastructure, when you're looking at things that organizations that do require have regulations around their implementation and that they have to adhere to, that is definitely one of the considerations. But the organizations that don't fall within critical infrastructure, that don't have specific regulations around the information security of these environments, that is lagging. And so it's definitely one of the things that the teams need to get a hold of and a handle on to improve their security posture, to understand how do they do it, understand the risk around it. But certainly organizations that don't have those requirements, don't have those regulations, that's why they're possibly not doing it within their organization.
All right, thanks. Are there any references or resources one can find to implement the CSF into data classification for ICS security? What is an ideal starting point?
That's an interesting one. In terms of data classification, I think that there's some fairly basic requirements in terms of, if you consider that most of the information that's going to flow across the operational network is data in some form or another, whether it's commands or data, I think you can start by classifying the basic data elements into potentially a command set that would be related to process versus data assets that would be the outcomes of those processes. Don?
Yeah, one of the things that I would consider, we're in these environments, we're thinking less about the flow of confidential information associated with PII, but certainly there's things that are associated with the process that might need some classifications. But from a tactical standpoint, if I was starting, I would do some data classification around the documentation associated with the process, how it's implemented, how it's deployed, configuration files and so forth, so that you can start understanding how to control them within the environment on your engineer and operator workstations, how they're distributed in file shares and so forth. So that's, from a tactical standpoint, that's what I would consider.
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of data for documentation and how that data flows. I agree.
All right, well, with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Barbara, Don, and Peter, for your great presentation, and to Fortinet for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you, everybody.